Ever seen those cozy Western movies where frontier families gather around a crackling fireplace, wrapped in quilts, singing songs while snow falls gently outside their sturdy log cabin? The kids are rosy-cheeked, there's a pot of stew bubbling away, and everything looks like a rustic Christmas card. Here's the reality. A family of 5 crammed into a one-room sod house with walls so thin you can see daylight through the cracks. The temperature outside has dropped to 30 below zero. The fire is dying because they're down to their last few pieces of wood, and the nearest town where they might get more is 3 days away on horseback. Except there's a blizzard outside that's already been raging for a week with no sign of stopping. The children haven't eaten anything but beans and salt pork in 2 months. Frostbite has already claimed 2 of the father's fingers, and if that chimney gets blocked by snow, they'll have to choose between freezing to death or suffocating from smoke. Winter on the frontier killed more settlers than gunfights, Indian raids, and disease combined. This is how they survived it, barely. The first problem was the shelter itself. Most frontier families weren't living in those solid log cabins you see on screen. They were living in sod houses, literal blocks of prairie dirt stacked like bricks with a roof of more dirt supported by thin wooden beams. These soddies leaked mud when it rained, attracted snakes and insects in summer, and in winter they were only marginally better than living in a hole in the ground. Which, actually, some people did. Dugouts were exactly what they sound like, caves carved into hillsides with a front wall added. They were dark, damp, and in winter, they were tombs of frozen earth. Even the good log cabins were nightmares of frontier construction. Settlers built them quickly, often alone or with minimal help, using whatever trees they could find. The logs were rarely uniform, which meant gaps, sometimes an inch wide, between every row. You could literally stand inside and see outside through dozens of cracks. Families stuffed these gaps with mud, rags, old newspapers, moss, and animal hair mixed with clay. It helped, but it never truly sealed. Wind didn't just leak in. It blew through with enough force to extinguish candles and scatter ash from the fireplace. To survive, families created a shelter within their shelter. They'd hang blankets or canvas sheets to divide the single room into smaller spaces, concentrating body heat. Everyone slept in the same area, often in the same bed, because a separate bedroom meant freezing to death in your sleep. Some families built interior walls from stacked furniture or grain sacks to block drafts. The goal was to heat one small space, not the entire structure, because that was impossible. Then there was the chimney, often the deadliest feature of the house. Many settlers built chimneys from sticks and mud because they lacked stone or brick. These stick chimneys were fire hazards that frequently caught the entire cabin ablaze. Even stone chimneys had problems. Poor draft design meant smoke backed up into the living space, filling the room with choking fumes. Families faced an impossible choice during blizzards: keep the fire going and suffocate slowly, or let it die and freeze. Before you could even think about surviving winter, you had to prepare for it, and that meant the woodpile. This wasn't a weekend project. A single family needed 20 to 30 cords of wood to make it through a frontier winter. One cord is a stack 4 feet high, 4 feet wide, and 8 feet long. Do the math. That's a pile of wood the size of a small house, and every piece of it had to be cut, split, hauled, and stacked by hand. The work started in late summer. Men spent entire days in the woods with handsaws and axes, felling trees, cutting them into logs, then splitting those logs into burnable pieces. Their hands blistered, then calloused, then blistered again. Women and children hauled the wood back to the homestead, load after load, sometimes walking miles. If you lived on the treeless prairie, you didn't have woods to go to. You burned buffalo chips, dried dung, or twisted hay into tight bundles. Both burned fast and gave off weak heat, which meant you needed even more of it. The woodpile wasn't just fuel, it was a countdown clock to death. Families obsessively monitored their supply throughout winter, calculating how many weeks they had left, rationing fires to 1 or 2 hours in the morning and evening. Some nights, they just didn't light one at all. They piled on every blanket they owned, wore their coats to bed, and shivered until dawn. Children woke with frost on their hair from their own frozen breath. Running out of wood midwinter was a death sentence, so families burned anything. Furniture went into the fire. Chairs first, then tables, then bed frames. Fences got torn down and fed to the stove. Some settlers burned their own cabin walls, piece by piece, trying to survive until spring in a structure that was slowly disappearing around them. If you think that sounds insane, consider the alternative: stepping outside into a blizzard with an axe, trying to find and chop wood in whiteout conditions with frozen fingers that could barely grip the handle. Frostbite was the cost of desperation. Men went out into storms to gather wood because they had no choice, and they came back with blackened fingers and toes. The tissue froze solid, died, and eventually fell off. There was no doctor, no hospital, no treatment except amputation with a heated knife and whiskey for anesthetic. If you had whiskey. Some men lost their hands one finger at a time, winter after winter, until they couldn't work anymore. Then their families starved. Summer's abundance was a cruel joke by February. Fresh meat, vegetables, fruit, anything that wasn't preserved or dried disappeared the moment cold weather hit. Winter meant living on the frontier's grim trinity: salt pork, dried beans, and hardtack. Day after day, week after week, month after month. Salt pork wasn't bacon as you know it. It was chunks of fatty pork preserved in barrels of brine so concentrated it could pickle leather. Before you could eat it, you had to soak it for hours to draw out enough salt that it wouldn't make you violently ill. Even then, it was so salty it triggered desperate thirst, which was its own problem when your water source was frozen solid and melting snow over a rationed fire took time and fuel you didn't have. The fat content was intentional, pure calories to keep bodies functioning in extreme cold, but it also meant your stomach never felt quite right, always heavy and queasy. Dried beans required soaking overnight and hours of boiling. In high altitudes or during fuel shortages, families ate them half-cooked because they couldn't afford the wood to boil them longer. The result was chronic indigestion, stomach cramps, and digestive misery that never really stopped. Children grew up thinking a stomach ache was just what life felt like. Hardtack was flour and water baked into bricks so hard they earned the nickname tooth dullers. You couldn't bite through them. Families smashed them with hammers or soaked them in coffee, if they had coffee, until they softened enough to chew. The flour was often infested with weevils by winter. People learned to ignore the larvae floating to the surface during soaking, or they picked them out, or they just stopped looking and ate them anyway because protein was protein. Vegetables existed only as pickled relics in jars: cucumbers, beets, cabbage. The vinegar burned your throat and the nutritional value was questionable, but it was something that wasn't meat or beans, so families savored them like luxury goods. Some settlers had root cellars where potatoes, carrots, and turnips could survive if the temperature stayed just above freezing. If it got too cold, everything froze and rotted. Too warm, and it sprouted or molded. Families checked their cellars like they were tending sick children. Scurvy crept in silently. It started with exhaustion that wouldn't lift, then bleeding gums, then teeth that loosened in their sockets. Old scars reopened for no reason. Bruises appeared without impact. By the time you recognized scurvy, you'd been suffering from it for weeks, and there was no cure available, no citrus, no fresh greens, nothing with vitamin C for hundreds of miles. Some frontier families made vinegar pie, a desperation dessert of vinegar, sugar, and flour that gave the illusion of fruit tang. It didn't stop scurvy. It just made the slow nutritional collapse slightly more palatable. The worst time was called starving time, late winter, when last year's harvest was nearly gone and spring planting was still weeks away. Families rationed themselves into deliberate hunger, eating one meal a day, then one meal every 2 days, watching their children's faces hollow out and their own strength fade. Hunting in deep winter was possible but brutal. Game was scarce, and tracking through snowdrifts in sub-zero temperatures while already weakened by malnutrition meant many men never came back. When a family was truly desperate, they slaughtered their livestock, the cow they needed for milk, the chickens that would lay eggs in spring. They ate their future to survive the present, knowing it meant next winter would be even worse. Some didn't slaughter the animals properly because they didn't have the skill. They just killed them however they could and butchered the carcasses badly, wasting meat they couldn't afford to waste. Then they salted what they could and hoped it wouldn't spoil before they could eat it, because spoiled meat still got eaten when the alternative was starvation. A broken leg in summer meant weeks of painful recovery. A broken leg in winter meant death. The frontier transformed into a frozen prison the moment the first blizzard hit, and isolation became as deadly as the cold itself. Families went weeks without seeing another human being. No neighbors dropping by, no travelers passing through, no one to help if something went wrong. And things went wrong constantly. Sickness didn't wait for spring. Pneumonia hit hard and fast in poorly heated cabins where damp cold soaked into everyone's lungs. Influenza tore through families in days. Infected wounds that would have been survivable with basic medical care turned gangrenous because there was no doctor within a 3-day ride. And that ride was impossible through snowdrifts taller than a horse. Women gave birth alone in frozen cabins, sometimes with only their terrified children to help, biting down on leather straps while their bodies tried to do something that killed women regularly, even with trained assistance. If the baby came breech, or if the mother hemorrhaged, there was no help coming. You survived or you didn't. Frostbite claimed pieces of people with casual efficiency. Going to the outhouse meant exposing yourself to temperatures that could freeze exposed skin in minutes. Men doing morning chores, feeding animals, breaking ice on water troughs, checking on livestock, came back inside with white patches on their cheeks and noses. The tissue was already dead. Within days, it blackened and hardened. Within weeks, it fell off or had to be cut away. Frontier families learned to recognize the waxy, numb look of freezing flesh and knew they were watching part of someone die while the rest of them kept living. Children were especially vulnerable. Their smaller bodies lost heat faster. A child who wandered too far from the cabin, even just to the barn, could become disoriented in blowing snow and freeze to death 20 feet from the door. Parents tied ropes between the house and outbuildings for this exact reason. Lifelines in whiteout conditions when you literally couldn't see your own hand in front of your face. Some families lost children anyway. The wind howled so loud you couldn't hear someone screaming for help 10 yards away. Then there was cabin fever, not the modern metaphor, but actual psychological breakdown from months of darkness, isolation, and unrelenting stress. Families trapped together in one room for 4 or 5 months straight, never able to escape each other, tempers worn down to raw nerves. Minor annoyances became explosive fights. Some settlers described a creeping paranoia, a sense that the walls were closing in, that they'd never see the sun again. A few walked out into blizzards deliberately and never came back. Others turned violent. In spring, when travelers finally reached remote homesteads, they sometimes found cabins with one survivor and several frozen bodies, and no clear story about what had happened during those dark months. Women suffered especially from the isolation, stuck inside with small children, often pregnant, watching their families slowly weaken. They had no outlet and no help. Postpartum depression in a frozen cabin with no support system meant some women simply stopped functioning. They lay in bed, staring at the ceiling while their children cried and their husbands tried desperately to manage everything alone. Some recovered when spring came. Others didn't. And if someone did die from illness, injury, childbirth, or simply giving up, you couldn't bury them. The ground was frozen solid, impossible to dig through. Bodies were wrapped in whatever fabric could be spared and stored in unheated outbuildings or snowbanks until the thaw. Families lived for months knowing their dead were waiting just outside, preserved in ice, a constant reminder of how close they all were to joining them. The blizzards didn't just bring snow, they brought annihilation. The kind of storms that turned the frontier into a white void where direction, distance, and survival became pure luck. These weren't the gentle snowfalls from paintings. They were meteorological assassins that could kill you in your own yard. The most infamous was the school children's blizzard of 1888. January 12th started warm, almost spring-like across the Dakota and Nebraska territories. Farmers worked in shirt sleeves. Kids walked to school without coats. Then the temperature dropped 40 degrees in 3 hours. Winds hit 60 miles per hour. Snow came horizontally in sheets so thick it turned noon into midnight. And everyone was caught outside, miles from shelter, dressed for spring. Teachers faced an impossible choice: keep children in unheated schoolhouses and hope the storm passed, or send them home before conditions worsened. Many chose wrong. Children left schoolhouses and disappeared into whiteness, so complete they couldn't see the ground beneath their feet. Some held hands in chains and walked until they collapsed. Farmers found them in spring, frozen in clusters, still holding on to each other. Others wandered in circles until exhaustion and cold stopped them permanently. The official count was over 200 dead. The real number was higher. Isolated homesteads where entire families vanished, and no one knew to look for them until months later. Sudden temperature drops were the frontier's cruelest trick. A Chinook wind could raise temperatures to 50 degrees, melting snow and fooling settlers into thinking winter had loosened its grip. Then, Arctic air would slam down from Canada, and the thermometer would plummet 60 degrees overnight. Wet clothes froze solid on bodies. Livestock caught in open range froze standing upright. Entire herds turned into statues that wouldn't thaw until April. Settlers who'd ventured out during the warm spell found themselves trapped miles from home as the cold returned, their sweat turning to ice against their skin. Whiteout conditions made your own property a death trap. Men left their front doors to feed animals in the barn and lost all sense of direction within seconds. The wind howled so loud you couldn't hear, the snow so thick you couldn't see, the cold so intense you couldn't think. They'd wander in what they thought was a straight line and end up walking parallel to the cabin or in circles, burning their remaining energy while hypothermia shut down their bodies. Families found them the next morning, frozen corpses 15 feet from the door they'd been trying to reach. That's why the rope systems existed. Settlers tied thick ropes from the house to the barn, the well, the outhouse, any structure they'd need to reach in a storm. You went out holding that rope like your life depended on it, because it did. Let go for even a moment to adjust your grip, and the wind could disorient you so completely you'd never find it again. Some families found dead neighbors still clutching the rope, frozen in place, who'd simply run out of strength before they could pull themselves back inside. The storms buried everything. Drifts piled 20 feet high against buildings, covering windows, blocking doors. Families woke to total darkness, trapped inside, and had to dig upward through packed snow just to get out. If the chimney got blocked, smoke had nowhere to go. If the roof collapsed under the weight, and many did, you were crushed or buried alive in your own home. Cattle died by the thousands. Ranchers who'd spent years building their herds watched them vanish in a single storm. The animals would turn their backs to the wind and drift with it until they hit a fence or ravine, then pile up against the barrier. The ones in front froze. The ones behind suffocated under the weight of more bodies pressing forward. Spring revealed mass graves of livestock stacked 10 deep for miles along fence lines. Entire fortunes wiped out overnight. Ranchers bankrupted by weather they couldn't predict or prevent. Winter on the frontier wasn't the fireside scene from holiday cards. It was families burning furniture to stay alive, children with swollen bellies from malnutrition, parents lying awake, calculating whether their food would last until thaw. The Wild West wasn't conquered by gunfighters. It was survived by ordinary people enduring cold that could kill in minutes, isolation that drove some insane, and hunger that hollowed them out from inside. Winter was the deadliest outlaw on the frontier, and it never missed.